All right. I
Mhm.
am very honored to be here with Rob Koons and Dan Bonevac, who have, as I understand, you can fill in the details here, recently completed a manuscript about Aquinas's five ways, and we're going to have a chat about that. But first, Rob and Dan, would you like to take a moment to just sort of introduce yourselves and yeah, tell people who you are?
Okay, yeah. That one's
Oh,
told us.
yeah, I'm Dan Bonevac, professor of philosophy and civic leadership at the University of Texas at Austin. I've been here for 45 years. And I started teaching a course on the history of Christian philosophy about 25 years ago, kind of on a spur of the moment idea. And it's continued and been really successful. And nobody else was quite doing anything like it.
Mm.
And then Rob started teaching contemporary Christian philosophy, and we tried to interlace them. But let me turn it over to you then.
Yeah, so I've been at UT for 38 years, so
Yeah.
not quite as many as 45, but still, we're getting up there. And it's trained in analytic philosophy. Both of us were really, Dan at Pittsburgh, me at UCLA. I came around to interest in Aquinas pretty late, I'd say in mid 90s. So I was already what was I, 40 something,
Right.
mid 40s. For me, it started actually teaching logic classes. So I was interested in finding some raw material to use, actual texts that were argumentative. Oh, I'll look at the five ways. I'd heard about them, as an undergraduate. And at the time, I was working on causation. And as I looked at these five ways, I thought, these are actually more interesting than people have thought. And so I put together a little article back then in 97 called it A New Look at the Cosmological Argument. And I've been sort of dragged into Thomism ever since then, basically step by step. So that now I do a lot of things relating to Thomas and through him, Aristotle. So those have kind of taken over my thinking in a lot of ways.
And I will say autobiographically that I was lucky enough to overlap with Rob and Dan during my time in graduate school at UT. I TA'd for Dan a couple of times, and I yeah have benefited from both of their work myself over the years. So super excited to have you with me today. Okay, so can you tell us a little bit about the project that it sounds like you've recently completed here? What is that exactly?
Yeah. So far, you told me that you were working on the third way, right?
That's right.
Yeah.
Rob taught a seminar on arguments for God's existence a few
Yeah.
years ago, and I sat in on it. It was a great seminar, but it inspired me thinking a lot about the third way. And so I came up with an interpretation of that and showed it to Rob, who recognized that I had left out an important premise and helped me fix up that part of it a lot. But then I said, "Hey, well, you've contributed so much to this. How would you like to co-author this?" And he said, "Well, actually, I'm thinking about a book on Aquinas. So I'll raise you one. How about co-authoring a book?" And I thought that was a great idea since I was convinced upon looking at the third way that there was a lot more here than people had realized.
Yeah.
And I thought that's probably the case with the other ways too. So
Yeah.
we began serious work on it. You had already written up things on the first and second ways.
Yeah.
And then we had extensive discussions about the fourth and fifth ways because initially neither one of us knew quite what to do with them.
Yeah.
But in the course of those discussions, we came up with some ideas for reinterpreting them, and we realized we really do have material for a book here. And then we proceeded to go through subsequent parts of the Summa, where you really get the arguments that there is one and only one God, that God is all powerful, all knowing, and so forth. Those don't follow from the five ways alone. And I think a lot of analytic philosophers have been misled. They think these are each an independent argument that's supposed to establish the existence of a God with all the classical properties of God.
Yeah.
That's not what they're doing in Aquinas. They're steps on a road.
Hmm.
And the road doesn't get fulfilled until near the end of part one. So all of those subsequent arguments come later. Now, I think the premises that he needs are already there in the five ways,
Yeah.
but the five ways don't make any of that explicit, and it requires further argumentation. But the
Yeah.
book spells all that out.
Yeah, I'd come up with a pretty new interpretation of the first way because I'd been wrestling with it for years and just couldn't get it to work until finally this idea dawned on me and I realized, okay, that made it all click together. And then Dan at the same time comes in with this new interpretation of the third way, which was also a mess. I thought, in terms of the standard interpretation, I thought, wow, we've got two of the five ways now in a really new form that's quite interesting. So yeah, it made a lot of sense to look at the others at that point. I'm really happy.
So
I think things have just fallen right into place in a remarkable way. So
Yeah.
So I'll say here, in my impression, and I don't know if you two would share it, is that it's pretty common for contemporary philosophers to only really encounter natural theology by way of the five ways. Often it's a whole hobby horse of mine, but it's quite possible to have a PhD in philosophy and indeed a career in philosophy and never really seriously engage with arguments for God. And so I think like what happens with a lot of people is they take a class as an undergrad and cover the five ways in one session or something. Maybe cover Anselm's ontological argument, and then they encounter kind of like not great versions of the five ways and conclude that that there's no there there. Natural theology is kind of a failed project, and so one of the really valuable things that seems like you two could contribute here is to build up these very famous five arguments, right? And sort of correct for this problem and show that no, actually, there's a whole lot that's really fascinating that's going on here. Maybe, I mean, you're welcome to react to that impression of mine. But then it would be great to just do a kind of overview of what the five ways are before we kind of dive into your specific interpretations of them, revisions of them, and so forth. So yeah, first, I mean, do you think that's broadly accurate about the sort of the state of natural theology and how philosophers think of this topic?
At least in analytic philosophy,
Hmm.
very much so. And it's been encouraged by figures like Bertrand Russell or Richard Dawkins, or really a number of others who look at it from the point of view of somebody who has first order logic in mind. And they're really not first order arguments. And so they look at them and say, well, gee, this doesn't make much sense, and identify some trivial logical fallacies that they think are going on and move on. And they teach that to students as well. And it can look that way if you are really not taking seriously the Aristotelian background and the conceptual framework that Aquinas is using. He's got all these distinctions, and for the most part, they're modal distinctions. You
yeah.
have to read these as arguments in modal logic, and a pretty sophisticated modal set theory, or at least the theory of relations. And if you don't do that, yeah, they're going to look bad, but they would look bad in the way that, arguments that use tools that go outside first order logic are going to look bad if you insist on putting them in a first order framework. So situate them in the right framework, and all of a sudden they make a lot of sense.
Yeah, our working hypothesis is that Aquinas is not an idiot.
Yeah.
That makes
It
all
seems
sense,
plausible.
really.
Yeah.
That's right.
If you start out assuming he is an idiot, then it's pretty easy to dismiss the arguments. And if you think, well, he's not, then when you come up with arguments that don't work, you realize, okay, we probably haven't got to the right one yet. And so we need to keep digging a little deeper.
Okay, so diving in. So the first way is an argument to an unmoved mover, right? So like what's the general overview here? How does that argument go?
So it's about change more
Uh-huh.
generally, not just locomotion, motion in space, but any kind of change. And, we argue that it's getting us not just to an unmoved mover, but to an immovable mover, something beyond the scope of time and change altogether. And the standard interpretation is one in which this depends on some kind of outdated mechanical theory, mechanics, physics of the 13th century. This is the view that Senator Anthony Kennedy popularized in his really good book on five ways, but it's very dismissive for that reason, as though there were just a bunch of gears and pulleys, right, in the universe, and God is turning the crank to make the whole thing go. So my interpretation, or our interpretation, is that it's really about time. That you have to make sense of it, you have to go back to Aristotle's theory of time and how that relates to change. and realize that it's an argument about what makes time itself move forward. Why does time advance? And we argue that that requires a cause that's outside of time itself to be the ultimate cause of that forward motion of time.
So this couldn't just be like the Big Bang or a
No,
subatomic particle or something like, yeah, yeah,
nothing
yeah.
that's fixed at some point in the time could
Yep,
possibly explain why time itself keeps moving forward.
yep, yep.
Right. There is a modal aspect to this that, to be fair, Aquinas doesn't make explicit, which is, I think, that if something could change, then it could be in time. And anything that could be in time is in time. In other words, being in time or being outside of time, those are necessary properties of things. It's not just a contingent thing that you're in time or outside of time.
Yeah.
And once you have that, when you get to an unmoved mover, you realize, well, okay, the real question is, could this thing move? If it could, then it could be something that actually as a cause of change, which would make it dependent. But it can't be like that. It would have to then be in time already. But the point of the argument is it is not in time. And so what we argue, therefore, is it has to be not just unchanged, but unchangeable and totally outside time altogether. And I think that becomes absolutely vital. The
Yeah.
first way is put first for a reason. He says it's the first and most obvious way. I don't know about the obvious.
To him, anyway.
Yeah, but it is the most crucial. It's the one that is constantly referred to later when he's proving the other properties of God. So I think in his view, once you've got the first way, you've already got a God that is outside of time.
Mm,
And that turns out to be vital to almost
nice.
everything else that follows. So that becomes the hidden background premise of all the other arguments to come. If you
Mm,
look at these all independently, you're going to miss that, and some of them will be missing an obvious, assumption. But he thinks he's already established it at the end of the first way, and he keeps using that again and again.
Yeah, the key
yeah, and
idea
so
is that change
yeah.
involves potentiality and actuality. So if something changes when some potentiality is actualized. So something that's unchangeable is a being that has no potentiality whatsoever. It's pure actuality, as Aristotle puts it. And that gives you a transcendent God in a certain very technical sense. It's very important.
Yes.
So a couple important things are already coming out here. So one, I mean, I've gathered from reading some things that Rob has said and listening to a past interview that you two did that you do think that the ways are sort of interconnected in a manner that I think many commentators have perhaps missed. And second, I mean, right here from the very first way, you already think that this is pretty clearly pointing towards a being um, that's that's quite obviously godlike, right? So it's not, so that already sort of allows us to potentially stave off the kind of objection that you get from somebody like Anthony Kenny and others who want to say, well, yeah, like you can sort of grant the first stage of this, but then say that this just bottoms out with some kind of natural object or something.
Right,
Um,
right, exactly. Yeah,
Right.
he concludes each of the ways saying something like, all men call this God, or we call this God. And we take that to mean that he thinks he's established a characteristic that the cause has, which only God has. So we haven't got all the characteristics of God, but we've got something that uniquely picks out God as the uh, ultimate cause.
Right.
okay. All right. And so now the second way is supposed to get us to some kind of first cause. I will say, as someone who knows a lot less than both of you, and who's also tried to teach this material, it can be challenging to distinguish the first and the second ways from one another. So maybe in giving a gloss of the second way, could you sort of help those of us who struggle somewhat to see what's really supposed to be different here to get clearer on that?
Yeah, so the first way is really just concerned with change.
Uh-huh.
That's the phenomenon that's trying to be explained. And the second way, it's anything that exists, really. We're looking at efficient causation. It doesn't actually mention existence in the second way still, but it talks about efficient causation, which is typically the cause of the existence of a thing. So we're asking now, why do things exist? And here too, we think that, well, I think here our interpretation differs less from the standard interpretation than in the other 5 ways, 4 ways. The rest of the ways. But still, there's some important difference because one of the standard interpretations is that this is talking about causation at a moment. So what causes things to exist right now? It has to be something else existing right now. And that's then again sort of collapses it back into the first way. It's one of the reasons why I think it's hard to sort them out. But in our view, the second way has nothing to do with time or change at all. So it would still apply even in a world where there were no time or no change, so long as there was some kind of potential for existence that some things had.
That's right. It's really, why is there something rather than nothing?
Yeah, yeah. And yeah. Now, of course, the
And
big problem, and we'll get to this later, is
yeah,
later Thomas says that there are infinite regresses,
yeah.
accidentally infinite regresses. So we got to figure out, what's going on there because he doesn't mention this in the second way itself.
And so to drive this point home, because I know that Aquinas famously rejects the Kalam cosmological argument. So as I understand, he doesn't think that reason alone can demonstrate that the past is finite. He accepts that on faith, right? But I think that a common misreading of the first and second ways does have him arguing to like some temporally first item
Yeah.
or first thing, but that's not the case. Yeah.
Right. No, exactly. And so, on our view, the first way already establishes that the cause is outside of time. So
Hmm.
you'd expect the second way to be talking about a timeless cause as well. And it
Right.
basically is. So again, it's not talking about the Big Bang or anything like that.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Okay. All right. And the third way. Okay, so this is for those of us who were educated in the analytic tradition, at least, I think this is the way that's the most familiar. It's some kind of contingency argument, right? So like it's something in the vicinity of what Leibniz was doing, what Descartes in one mode was doing, right? So this is a kind of familiar argument. But Aquinas's version of it, I think, is also importantly different. So yeah. So what is the third way?
Yeah, the third way is the one which we think is most commonly mistranslated.
Hmm.
The English representations of this are all about time. And we actually think the argument has nothing to do with time at all. And when you look at the Latin, he never uses the word time. There are expressions that often are used in a temporal sense, but they don't have to be. And there are lots of uses you can point to.
Actually, I'd say in scholastic philosophy, they're typically not temporal.
That's right. They're typically not
They're
temporal.
typically modal.
Exactly. They're modal. And so, for example, he will say things like, virtues are sometimes like this and sometimes like that. Well, he means some virtues are like this. It's possible for virtues to be like this. It's possible for other virtues to be like that. He doesn't mean, oh, virtues change their character from time to time. It's not about time. And the same thing happens here. So the way the argument is structured, he's basically saying, look, and he says, by the way, this is about possibility and necessity. So when he describes the argument, it's about contingency and modal characteristics. It's not about time. But people often read it in a sort of way that is misleading because he's saying, look, suppose there are some contingent things. Well, those are things that could be or could fail to be. Okay, they might exist, they might not. But then he seems to say, well, anything that might fail to exist really does fail to exist at a certain time. And if everything were like that, everything could go out of existence, in fact, would have gone out of existence at some particular time. But then there'd be nothing now. So the end, more or less, of the controversial part of the argument. And that seems like a terrible argument. But if you think, wait, it's not about time, he's saying that to be contingent, it's possible for you to not exist.
Right.
And then what we think is unarticulated is a principle of subtraction that says if things at least are ontologically independent, you could subtract one of them without causing anything new to exist. So let's say there are a certain number of particles here in the universe and we take one out. Well, it's not like there's some principle that says, oh, another particle has to replace it. That would be a world with just fewer particles. But then you can either do this all at once, or you could do it bit by bit, take things out one by one, and eventually you end up with a world where there is nothing at all. Now,
Not a time in the past where there was nothing.
that's right. It's not a time in the
Right.
past. It's a possible world where there would be nothing. Okay, because each thing here, if it's contingent, could be subtracted. But by the subtraction principle, it's independent. Nothing has to replace it. And so we could keep doing this, or maybe do it all at once. But in any case, we could end up with a world that has nothing. And here's the key factor. You can't go from nothing to something. If you really were in a situation where nothing existed, it would not be possible for anything else to exist. So this is what I've called the dead end lemma. That would be a modal dead end. It would not be possible to ever get out of it. And that is the key to what Aquinas is doing, because he's saying, look, if everything were contingent, we could subtract things in such a way to end up with an empty world. But from the point of view of that empty world, nothing would even be possible. And in particular, it wouldn't be possible for us to exist. But we actually do exist,
Yeah.
which shows you there is no such world. And so we get a contradiction. That means it can't be the case that everything is contingent. There must be a necessary being. And then the second part of the argument is fairly straightforward.
Very similar to the second way.
Very,
Actually,
yeah, exactly. Either its
now-
necessity is dependent or independent. Well, if it were dependent on something else necessary, we could have an infinite regress. That makes no sense. There must be something that is not only a necessary being, but has its necessity independently of anything else. And so that there too is a property that only God has.
All right. Yeah.
But putting in time just confuses the whole matter. I mean, then it looks invalid.
Yeah. Yeah.
Or really bad premises, really implausible premises.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly.
That just because each thing could fail to exist, therefore there's a time when everything fails to exist. It's just that'd be a bad inference or bad premise. But we don't need that. Yeah.
Yeah, that's what we can loop back to this, but it does strike me as I listen to you describe it that maybe there are some advantages that this formulation has over many that feature more prominently in contemporary debates. But
Yeah.
yeah.
I mean, the first part doesn't actually rely on any no infinite regress premise. The second part does, but the first part doesn't. So it's in that sense, it's a bit different from the Leibniz-Descartes kind of contingency argument. Significantly.
Yeah.
And it relies on this, what Dan mentioned, it relies on a premise, an axiom called B in modal logic. It's very widely accepted, especially in the metaphysical context, that if something is impossible, that's necessarily impossible, right? So,
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's basically the symmetry idea
Yeah.
in the modal semantics.
Right.
And because that an empty world is possible from our world, what really gets the contradiction is going is the thought that, well, then from its point of view, we would be impossible. It's relevant to look at things from its point of view. So in S5, which is what I think Aquinas actually assumes in the background, because he thinks, look, a possible world is a possible world. They're all sort of, from God's point of view, on an equal footing, so they're all accessible to each other. But really, all he needs is that B axiom, the thought that if we have this relation among these possible worlds, it's a symmetric relation, something like a similarity relation. That's the part that's vital to this argument. But it is an extremely plausible idea.
Right.
And honestly, I think everybody thinking about modality, with the possible exception of Ramon Llull, who was weird, assumed S5 in the background all the way through until what? I mean, until C.I. Lewis.
Probably, yeah.
Yeah.
20th century.
That's right.
Yeah.
I mean, I know of more than a few people who've been tempted to reject S5 because they think that it leads to God. So it's like, oh, that can't be,
right.
that can't be true.
There's always that.
They're right. But
Right.
it does lead to God.
Yeah. Well, Mackey in The Miracle of Theism, he admits that S5 is the most reasonable logic for metaphysical necessity. I think that is still the default position. Yeah. So, I mean, we're not going to claim that these arguments are going to persuade everybody in the world.
Right.
But we're just trying to show that they're as relevant now as they were 1800 years ago. They're still
Yeah.
worthy of consideration.
Yeah.
Yeah, and the premises they rest on are pretty plausible, common-sensy premises.
Yeah.
From one point of view, they're premises from Aristotelian metaphysics, but they're the parts of Aristotle that are very common sense.
Themselves most plausible.
That's right, the most plausible parts.
And
Exactly.
most central, right? It's not, it doesn't, again, contrary to Kenny, none of this depends on crystalline spheres in the heavens and
Yeah.
any of that kind of stuff.
No, right.
Yeah, yeah. Okay. All right. The fourth way. So my
Yeah.
understanding is that the fourth way begins from, you can correct this, refine this as you will, that we look out in the world and I find that we're in a world where there's value. Seems eminently plausible. Right, there's objective value that we don't just make up by valuing things. There are gradations of value. Some things, like a slug maybe has a little bit more value than a rock, and mammals have some kind of like more value than a slug does, and you have humans. And then the thought is supposed to be, well, given that there's value and that there are degrees of value, there must be something that like has all the value or that is the source of value, something like that. Is that along the lines of what he's thinking here?
That's the standard view.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Right. I mean, the puzzling thing about the fourth way is it does suggest that, and then one wonders, well, this sounds an awful lot like Anselm, right? And
Yeah.
yet, in just a few articles earlier, he's completely dismissed the Anselmian approach. So we
Mm,
have to try to figure out, okay, how is an Aristotelian who really rejects that kind of Platonistic thinking? What's he got in mind here, the fourth way?
mm,
And I think we decided that the key really was to look at the passage that he mentions. The only place where he actually mentions a passage in Aristotle in the fourth way. He refers to Alpha the Lesser in the Metaphysics. And so you got to go back there and look at that and say, well, what's going on in Alpha the Lesser? And that turns out to be the key, I think, to understanding what's going on here, which is that there's a kind of principle of proportionality involved, so that when something causes another thing, the cause has to have at least as much actuality in some sense as the effect. It has as much being as Aristotle puts it in the Alpha the Lesser. And so by the time we got to the fourth way, right, we've established that there is a first cause, which is the necessary cause of the existence of everything else, right? And so then you apply this Alpha the Lesser principle. This first cause must have existence to a supreme degree, and that's it. So the stuff about the degrees of goodness, I think,
mhm,
there's two parts of the argument. My interpretation is that first part is just to get us to recognize there's a conceptual possibility of a maximal being. Whereas Anselm thinks you can actually define the sort being, the perfect being, into existence using this. I think for Anselm, for Aquinas, it's much more modest. Just it makes sense to talk about degrees of being. Now we've got a first cause from the first three ways that causes the being of everything else. Proportionality suggests that it must be maximally real, maximally existing, which makes sense. That's what was established in the first sense, first part. So it's really, from our point of view, it's not an independent argument for a first cause, which is what most people take it to be. We also take the fifth way in a similar way. So for us, the fourth and fifth way are building on the foundation of the first three ways and beginning to draw some conclusions from what follows from the fact that something is the cause of the existence of everything else.
Yeah,
Okay,
the
yeah,
key premise here is one that actually the Latin, to be fair, does suggest, because what he says is that the maximum of a thing is the cause of everything else in the genus having that characteristic to the degree that it has. Um, and it wasn't until Rob actually went back to Alpha the Lesser that he realized, wait a minute, this is an identity statement. And actually, in Aristotle, he doesn't say that if you are maximal, you cause everything else. He says if you cause everything else in the genus to have this characteristic to the degree that they do, then you have that to the greatest degree. And when you look at Aquinas, you realize, oh, it's an identity statement. It isn't an if then,
Biconditional at the very least.
it's at least a biconditional. And
Yeah.
so the question is which is primary?
Which
And
way is he using it in the argument?
that's right. And then we went and looked at his commentary on the metaphysics, and there he makes it quite clear. He realizes that Aristotle is not saying that if you're the maximum, you cause everything. It's rather that if you are the cause of everything, then you're maximum. And that's really what Aristotle was trying to get at. I think that's what Aquinas, to be fair, rather unclearly is trying to say in the fourth way. And once you make that substitution, it all falls into place.
It's clearly distinct from Anselm now.
Yes, clearly
Yeah.
distinct from Anselm
Yeah.
because it relies on that causal premise. And also you've got then something that is highly plausible and
Yeah.
actually works. So a silly sounding argument, and even to a lot of the medieval and early modern commentators, they kind of pass over the fourth way. Some don't mention it at all
Yeah.
because they're a little embarrassed by it. They think we don't,
Even Thomas.
even Thomas,
Maybe especially Thomas is embarrassed by the fourth way.
yeah.
Yeah.
And by the way,
Geach says he doesn't make any sense of it at all.
no, exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, even Geach can't deal
Yeah.
with it.
Yeah.
But we think it's actually really plausible. Now, my view is that it's sort of a late addition because he doesn't refer back to it later when he's establishing certain properties of God.
Yeah.
Um,
And it doesn't have any precursors in the Summa Theologiae or anywhere else.
No.
So
it kind of pops out of nowhere.
yeah.
But he does derive that same conclusion almost independently when he's getting
Yeah.
to certain
And he
characteristics.
was working on the commentaries on Aristotle at the same time as
Yes.
the Summa Theologiae. So he may have been working on Alpha Lesser and thought, oh, there's a fourth
That's right.
way.
There's a fourth way. Yeah.
That's really helpful for me because I mean I actually really like Anselm's argument, and so I think it's
Mhm.
natural for me to read the fourth way and say, oh, okay, yeah, this is just kind of like this. He's
Yeah.
doing the Anselm thing here, but of course that does not fit very well with the totality of Aquinas's actual thought. So yeah,
Right.
The bizarre deviation for him.
yeah.
Yeah.
And I should say also for the benefit of the audience that Rob and Dan, I believe it's true that both of you read both Latin and Greek, and so that's why you're able to parse the texts as carefully as you have.
Yeah, it's real important, I think, actually, because so many of the translations are misleading. So in this case, many translators will translate it as an if-then statement, if maximum, then the cause, which is not in the Latin at all, and it really distorts things. Some
Just for,
the Dominican or the English Benedictine fathers, they're okay, but a lot of the other translations are actually mess that up.
for my own curiosity, does some of this have to do, you think, with the fact that the people doing the translating oftentimes are not themselves well versed in philosophy? Is that part of the issue? Or
I think so because
Yeah, or partly they've been taught how to interpret the argument, and so they're kind of helping make it clearer.
yeah, that is true. They have things to try to help, and it's not a help. But yeah, I think sometimes what they do in the translation would make perfect sense if this were Cicero you were translating.
Yeah,
It's
right.
just
there's that too.
yeah,
right.
the medievals and
Let's
especially
just use a different word, just make it sound a little more interesting, more varied. Right?
well, that's the other thing. They
Yeah.
think they want the English to sound fun,
Yeah.
and so they will translate the same Latin word several different ways in the English, or they'll use
Or
the
vice
same
versa.
English term for several
Yeah.
different Latin
Yeah,
words.
right.
They're going for style and not precision.
Substance. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
yeah, all right. All right. Now the fifth way. Okay, so the really
Yeah.
terrible version of the fifth way understands it as just like a Paley style design argument.
Yes, right.
So that's definitely not the case.
That's definitely wrong. Yeah.
Yeah, right. The one that's less obviously wrong, I suppose, holds that we just like we observe a world of value, we also observe a world of purpose. So we look out in the world and we see that we sort of see purpose, and then well, the purpose needs explanation. And so the explanation is going to have to be in terms of some kind of a purpose giver. But I'll toss that over to you all now and let you
Yeah.
let you refine that.
Yeah. Yeah, this I think is pretty close to Ed Feser's interpretation, which again is much better than the Paley type interpretation for sure. But the difficulty I think with Feser's interpretation is that it's sort of somewhat incoherent because on the one hand he'll say, well, let's figure out what Aquinas and Aristotle mean by teleology and purpose. They just mean that things happen in a regular way. They in other words, there's no attribution of what we would call intentionality or consciousness or desire on the part of the rock that's moving to the earth, right? It's just that rocks move to the earth in a regular sort of way. And Aquinas does say this explicitly that if things didn't act for an end, he says, there would be no reason for them to do one thing rather than another. So the very idea that I think in modern science we capture with ideas of laws of nature, things operate according to laws of nature, is the same thing that Aquinas is attributing here to teleology. And Fraser recognized that. So it's okay. Fraser's, yeah. So there's we can have teleology without any kind of purpose of the mind behind it. But then we need a purpose of mind behind it. So wait a minute. You just got through telling us we didn't need that. Now we're told that we do need it. So again, I think that what we think that what's going on here is that you have to bear in mind that we've now established that there is a first cause, right? And so this first cause is an uncaused thing, right? So I think what Aquinas is getting at here is that if something is acts for a purpose and it's unintelligent, then it acts for that purpose because its nature directs it to that particular end, right? So, heavy things, earthy things move to the center of the universe because that's their nature to do that, right? But why do they have that nature rather than a different nature? Why things with those natures, right? Well, that needs a cause, right? We need to have some sort of explanation as to why they have a nature that's directed to this particular end. So this, of course, means we'd have we'd have a cause that causes it to have its nature. Does it act unintelligently because of its nature? Well, then we need another cause and so on. We get an infinite regress. So we need a regress stopper here. We need something that can direct things to ends without requiring a cause for its own self-direction. And the idea is that that's an intelligent being. So an intelligent being acts for reasons rather than for causes, does things because they're good, not because it's sort of moved to do it by itself. So the crucial point of the fifth way is just to show that anything that's unintelligent is caused, not necessarily caused by an intelligent thing. We don't need that principle. Just if you're an unintelligent thing, but you act for a purpose, you must be caused in some way to do that. Right? So then do the contrapositive, right? If something's uncaused, it must therefore be intelligent, because if it were unintelligent, it would have to be caused to act in the way that it does. So it's like a pretty simple inference, and it's a pretty plausible one, I think, actually. Nothing to do with design argument, nothing to do with any kind of view that somehow purpose needs to be behind all teleology per se. That's not really assumed by the argument either.
Just out of curiosity, do you think that something like this view was present even in Aristotle?
That's interesting. Plausibly, yes, I think. If you look at what he says, he says a lot of things in Metaphysics Lambda, especially about God, that are very similar to the kind of conclusions that Aquinas gets. It's often puzzling. I think, where does Aristotle get there? How does he arrive at this? How does he know that that nature does nothing, pointlessly, right? That God has a purpose behind things. How does he get there? And I think it's plausible that he had something in mind like this. Yeah.
Yeah.
I
The
ask.
couple of books of the physics, I think that's true as well.
Yeah.
That people don't realize this because I think they don't read the physics sort of from beginning to end as one book. But when they do, you realize this is all an argument for God's existence. And there are passages that are strongly suggestive of several of the ways.
Yeah.
This is something I know very little about. I feel like I need to educate myself somewhat because I think that a lot of us anyway, we're educated in a way that led us to read Aristotle as some kind of naturalist, right?
Yeah.
Where God's not really in the picture, but that does not that's not aligned
Not
with much of what he said. Yeah.
Yeah,
So,
it's interesting. There's been a revival of Aristotelian ideas in philosophy in the last 100 years, roughly, in ethics and epistemology and philosophy of nature, but not in theology.
yeah.
That's the one thing no one has touched yet, and
Yeah.
I hope that this will encourage people to reopen that question.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Now, to be fair, one thing there's a way of reading the book that we've written as a way of saying, look, a lot of the early commentators on Aquinas actually got things right. They didn't have the conceptual tools we have to make the structure of the arguments clear, but they weren't wrong in their interpretations. To some extent, our interpretations, I've thought of them as radically new, and in a way they are, but they could be viewed as elaborations of things that were said by much earlier commentators like Capriolus, for example, or by traditional Thomists like Garrigou-Lagrange. So we're not really there has been a group of people who've been defending the five ways all along, or at least some of them. And I think most of what they're saying is right. It's just that it's not, it has not been said in a way that would make any sense to analytic philosophers. And it doesn't really spell out in detail the logic of the arguments.
Hmm.
So if somebody were to say, oh, you guys are really just presenting and defending in detailed terms this traditional interpretation dating from fairly early commentators, even the School of Salamanca, I think that's right.
Yeah, that's
We're
right.
sort of rediscovering things. It's as if the first order emphasis of analytic philosophy made people think all these arguments were unintelligible, but they're really not. But it's only, I would say, since Kripke that we've had the tools to understand what's going on in them.
Hmm. So that provides a helpful segue, I think. So what I'll do now is, in the interest of diving a little bit deeper, sort of lob some specific objections to each of the five ways at you, and you can handle those between yourselves as you want, and then we can turn to maybe kind of big picturing and thinking of more general objections and so forth after that. Okay, so I won't go through everything that I had on the outline here, but just sort of picking some things I think would be cool to elaborate on a little bit further. Okay, so looping back to the first way, um, yeah, so there are a pair of kind of related objections relating to modern science and the supposed ways in which modern science has displaced the medieval and the ancient categories that Aquinas and Aristotle respectively were working with here. So so first, is the first way, I know you kind of addressed this before, but is the first way undercut by Newtonian and post-Newtonian mechanics? Does it depend upon outdated physics? And then second, yeah, doesn't quantum mechanics just show us that like things can pop into being from nothing, so we don't need a first cause or whatever? Okay, yeah. So do with that what you want.
Yeah, great, great. Yeah, so the first one I think is really crucial. So people from Anthony Kenny and many others have argued that look, Aquinas didn't have the principle of inertia, neither did Aristotle. Once you throw that into the picture, there's no problem. You don't need you don't need an unmoved mover to keep things going, right? And so I gave that a lot of thought. And one of the things I realized is that Aristotle has lots of things that are very similar to principle of inertia. There are lots of things in Aristotle that sort of move themselves, right? Heavy things move to the center of the universe by their own nature. Nothing has to push them. The heavenly spheres rotate because that's what they do. Nothing has to keep pushing them to rotate the way they do. So why does he think you need a unmoved mover, right? And it occurred to me that suddenly one day that, well, look, the principle of inertia is a principle that is time dependent. It says if time passes and you've been moving at a certain velocity, you keep moving at that same velocity. Inertia does not tell you why time itself advances, right? That has to come from outside the principle of inertia. And once you grasp that, then suddenly all these objections just fall away. You realize, no, there's a deeper problem here, which is time. For Aristotle, time is not some static fourth dimension, right? Time is a byproduct of change, right? So in order for time to progress, change has to keep happening, right? But that keep happening requires a cause that's outside of time itself. And so I think that resolves that problem. Now, quantum mechanics is another interesting situation. So um, I mean, I think this is a whole other research project of mine, is to
Yeah,
argue
yeah.
that actually Aristotle is needed to make sense of quantum mechanics, not that quantum
I'll
mechanics
I'll I'll link to
is
that. Yeah, yeah.
yeah. I'll just give you the simplest answer, which is something that Heisenberg recognized in his book on physics and philosophy, which is quantum mechanics rediscovered Aristotle's potentiality. And I think that's right. So before quantum mechanics, you could ignore potentiality in physics. You could just describe the actual world, plop down a bunch of deterministic laws, and everything is fine. But quantum mechanics says, no, you have to take into account all the potential paths that the particles could take and the probabilities that those different paths have. And then you have to have the measurement problem solved so that's a transition from potentiality to actuality. So you get all these Aristotelian elements there. And you have the same problem again. So the Schrodinger equation says, as time passes, the wave function will evolve in certain ways, but it doesn't tell you why time passes. So to make the Schrodinger equation work, you have to have an external explanation for time itself passing, moving forward.
All right. the second way. Okay, so well, the essence existence distinction. Maybe we could talk a little bit more about that. So I gather that you think that the essence existence distinction is crucial to understanding the second way in a way that modern commentators and readers have tended to miss. Can you flesh that out a little bit?
So, like just as in the first way, we argue that there has to be not just an unmoved mover, but an immovable mover. So we're arguing the second way he needs not just an uncaused cause, but an uncausable cause. So the question is, what would something have to be like to be such that its existence couldn't be caused in principle? Um, and that's not an easy thing to solve. And it turns out that Aquinas himself has a theory about how this works, which is that the distinction between an actually existing thing and a potentially existing thing depends upon the presence or absence of an active existence, is what he calls them, actus essendi. And so when you cause something to exist, what you're doing is you're causing an active existence to combine with a certain essence in order to bring that thing into existence. So something that would be uncausable would be something where there's no such combination possible of an active existence with an essence. So you need something whose very essence is an active existence already. And now you've got something that's uncausable in principle. And that's going to be the thing that is needed to cause everything else.
And this is the
Yeah.
key to divine simplicity, then, because God is God's own existence. If they were separable, then God would be causable, because something would have to explain why the act of existence and that essence go together. So they can't be separated. So that God is simple actually follows critically from this. He doesn't argue that explicitly until a little bit later, the section right after the five
Yeah,
ways,
right.
actually. But it's kind of obvious consequence once you have this. I find it interesting that lots of contemporary theologians get upset about divine simplicity,
Yeah.
since it seems to me the moment you deny it, you've
Mm,
got a causable God, and that's
mm,
that's bad on any
mm.
conception, really.
Yeah.
So on the understanding of divine simplicity that you're both working with here, God just is existence. Is that what you'd want to say?
In a sense, although I think it's better to say that he is his own active existence.
Okay.
So it's an active existence that's not contracted, as Aquinas puts it, to a particular nature or essence, but is just pure existence in and of itself. So in a sense, it is something like the form of existence, I say in a
Mhm.
Platonic sense. Um, the absolute unmixed, unmitigated, unconstrained existence.
Yeah, it's the kind of language that makes analytic philosophers very uncomfortable because it sounds
Mhm.
like Heidegger.
Yeah.
Being, we're going to think about being. But on the other hand, I think, how did Heidegger start out? He was studying theology and
Mm.
working on this. So I
Yeah,
think
right, right.
I'm not suggesting that one follow him down that path at all, but I think
Want to be careful where you follow Heidegger. Yeah.
very, very careful. Yes, exactly. Uh, but yeah, I think there is something here that is really talking about God being the same as God's own act of existence. So the people who say, well, look, if you're saying God just is existence, then this is kind of uninteresting because yeah, existence exists or something and blah blah blah.
Right.
That's
It's not like the
it's
lowest
not like
common
that.
denominator of all existing
Right.
things. And Aquinas very explicitly says that's not the case later
Yes.
in Summa. So it's just that it's rather, I think of it as he's a 24 karat gold existence. Existence unmixed with anything else, anything less than existence. That's what he's after. I mean, I think it's helpful too to think about the fact that every account has to give some sort of explanation as to what makes existence, you know, existence. How,
Hmm.
how does the actual real differ from the merely potentially real, right? So, if you go with David Lewis, well, there isn't any difference, right? Everything's on a par, and the actual existence is just a kind of indexical way of referring to our little world. But come on, that's a crazy view, right? There's got to be something special about the actual world that distinguishes it from the others. And for Aquinas, that's the presence of these acts of existence. So it's a plausible account. I think everybody needs some sort of account. And what's nice about it is that if you do adopt this account, then you can tell a story about what the uncausable thing would be like. And I don't know of any alternative where you have such a similar attractive account of the uncausable.
Yeah. Um, for the third, I think Dan's exposition of the third way was sufficiently fleshed out as to more or less answer the objections that I had noted here. But maybe in revisiting that one briefly, I could just ask you the question: what, if anything, do you think your interpretation of Aquinas on the third way has going for it over the extant, more familiar versions of the contingency argument that people tend to talk about more, at least in the analytic literature?
Well, for one thing, it's valid, so that's right. But the other, yeah, actually, it's something we talk about in the book because it would seem as if you could come up with a much simpler argument. Why go through this idea of subtracting entities and ending up in an empty world and so on, when you could just say, hey, let's use the same sort of infinite regress argument. A contingent thing would have to be dependent on something and blah. And I think it's a real question. Why does he do this? Um, Now it might just be, hey, I've got this other idea. Here's another path. So that, it could be that there's not much of an answer to this. It's just another way. But I think part of it is that he's really trying to get at a fundamental principle of naturalism. And you might imagine it this way. Suppose things started with the Big Bang, and the Big Bang might have happened, might not have. We were just lucky. All of a sudden, boom, in this universe. I think he's trying to say, look, there's something actually deeply incoherent about that idea of something coming out of nothing in that sort of way. It couldn't be like that. And not just because things have to be caused, though that's a key part of it. It's because if you really had even the possibility of an empty world, you could never get out of it. And so I think he's not thinking, here's some stuff, it depends on things, that chain of dependence has to stop somewhere. I think he's thinking of it from the opposite point of view. Suppose you really were in a situation where there was nothing. Can you imagine something contingently just bursting into existence? And I think based on his way of understanding potentiality and actuality, he realizes, no, that could never happen. You would be stuck there. And so I think he's thinking if you start from the other end of the chain, really, you get a different perspective on this and one that's directly relevant to that thought that occurs to Kenny and all sorts of other people, which is why doesn't the Big Bang just act as your regress stopper and fix this whole set of problems? I think that's his answer. Like, no, if you were in a situation where it, where it might happen, might not, it can't happen.
Yeah, I mean, having two, at least mostly independent arguments, right, for the same conclusion too is an advantage, right? So,
Right.
you end up with in both cases there's a kind of causal principle involved, but they're different causal principles. And in the one case, there's an infinite regress assumption, no regress assumption that's not needed. In the second one, there's a kind of subtraction principle. So, there are different strategies that I think complementary to each other.
Yeah, it is interesting that in the Summa Contra Gentiles, he has, just in a very short paragraph,
Yeah,
that infinite regress version of
yeah,
this.
yeah,
He doesn't repeat that in the Summa Theologiae, and
yeah.
I'm not sure why. Maybe he thinks it's so obvious it's not worth saying, or
Yeah,
maybe
or it's
that's
close
what.
enough to the second way that he doesn't need to
Yeah,
repeat
maybe.
it. Yeah, yeah. Now it's interesting because we started out thinking, as a lot of people did think, that the five ways is just a kind of précis, a condensed version of the longer arguments in the Summa Contra Gentiles 113. And we came up thinking, no, that's completely wrong, actually. So where there are simpler arguments in the five ways, it's because he simplified the argument and
Mm,
made it better in the process. And in many cases, they're just completely new arguments. Third and fourth ways are completely new. So.
interesting. Yeah, I will say also, I think that a lot of people are unaware that Aquinas said anything about these arguments beyond the handful of pages that contains what
Well,
people
right.
usually recognize as the five ways. Which is,
Yeah, no, exactly. Yeah.
um, okay, vis-a-vis the fourth way, I think I'll lob this one at you. So I can imagine, like a contemporary analytic ethicist, just saying, well, look, I mean, we can talk about value existing in an atheistic world, right? Like we don't need God to talk about goodness. We could be like G more, talk about good as some kind of undefinable, non-naturalistic property that just exists. And so, yeah, I mean, what would you say to such a person who says that we can just totally disentangle all talk of value from an ultimate being, from perfect being?
I mean, I don't think the fourth way is challenged by that thought, actually. Um, I mean, I think one could develop another argument, from the objectivity of value to God as the sort of paradigm of goodness.
Hmm.
I don't think that's the fourth way, actually. So, but we could talk about that as well, that argument, because I have some sympathies with that argument. It's sort of an Augustinian argument, I think, and but it's not one that Aquinas is relying on here.
No, that's right. This isn't a moral argument for
Yeah,
God's existence.
yeah,
This is rather an
yeah.
argument that
Even axiological argument or anything like that.
that's right.
Yeah,
We've got this immovable mover, this uncausable cause, and those have already been established in the first and
Hmm.
second ways. And this is then saying, look, that being has existence to the highest possible degree, and is
Okay.
responsible for these qualities that other things have, the excellences that other things
yeah.
have.
I mean, it'll turn out that God is eminently desirable, right? But that comes later, in the structure when he talks about God is good. That's where he actually makes the case that this being is supremely desirable in some sense. But in the fourth way, we're just showing that
Yeah.
it's a non-axiological sense of
Yeah.
perfection
Yeah. Yeah.
existing to the ultimate degree, so to
Right.
speak.
Yeah, the perfectus in Latin
Yeah, yeah,
is usually translated as perfect, but
yeah,
it tends to mean complete.
yeah.
And so it's, thoroughly made. That's
Yeah, yeah. Aquinas
so
actually talked about that in the article on perfection. He says, "Well, of course, God isn't made, but what it means is
right.
he's thoroughly being. Right? He exists to the fullest possible degree, to such a degree that he couldn't be made."
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. So I guess that kind of objection or that kind of challenge engages with exactly the kind of interpretation of the fourth way that you want to reject ultimately. But
right,
that's
exactly.
interesting that yeah, that you think that yeah, that Aquinas is not going to reject that kind of view just like out of hand. He doesn't think that there's a conceptual or some kind of analytic connection between goodness and God or value in God, if that's does that sound right? Where
He thinks there isn't or is
he thinks
difference.
that there isn't is
Yeah, not at least not a direct one, right?
yeah,
The connection is going to have to be more indirect.
yeah. Okay, interesting.
Yeah, and it's certainly not going to be analytic. It'll
Yeah,
be,
right. Yeah,
but relying on causal and metaphysical principles that run pretty deep.
yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Okay.
Yeah, he's going to get in later into the idea that every creature seeks its own perfection, and then rational creatures that requires the knowledge of God ultimately to be perfect our intellectual capacities. And so,
Right.
so that's why God is the ultimate good for a human being. Um,
Um, the fifth way. So I think
yeah.
we haven't talked about evolution at all. So maybe I'll just say the word evolution and see. But yeah, so um, right. So I can do a little bit better than that. It seems like it's some kind of advantage of the fifth way, at least as I've understood the fifth way, which is different from what you two are advocating. That you can grant the whole evolutionary story and still say, well, look, the idea of purpose seems like it's ineradicable from our thought. It's even ineradicable from like evolutionary biology. You still find the hardcore Darwinians talking in terms of purpose, and so the fifth way is just sort of immune to any kind of evolutionary debunking of yeah, of like an argument to God. What do you think about that? Are there advantages that you see to the fifth way over like updated Paley style design arguments? What do you think about this as it relates to would Aquinas have been upset by evolution and thought that, oh, like this undercuts the fifth way or something?
I mean, we would have been surprised by the theory of evolution for sure,
Mm, yeah.
but I don't think it will undercut the fifth way at all.
Yeah.
But I don't think the fifth way is actually referring to any specifically biological kind of teleology, right? So even if it were just an inorganic world and
Mm,
things had causal powers, but active and passive causal powers, there's already a kind of physical intentionality to the world, as David Armstrong puts it, or other people put it. So once you're into a kind of causal powers ontology, things are ordered to the future in a certain way, right? They're potentially heatable, or they're potentially movable in certain ways, and so that already is for Aristotle, for Aquinas and Aristotle, that's already sufficient for teleology. So certainly evolutionary people believe that the world is made of orderly things that have causal powers, right? So for sure they can't demur at that point. So the question is just, I think for us, the fifth way is why do things why do things have the tendencies they have? Why do they have these tendencies, right? And the only way to produce a regress stopper is to say some things make things happen just because they're good, right? And that requires intelligence. So the uncaused cause has to be an intelligent being.
nice.
Yeah, for me, what made the light bulb go off in my head was actually thinking about this in connection with Kant. It's rare that thinking about Kant makes light bulbs go off in my head.
Yeah, exactly.
But in
Usually the
this
opposite for me.
but in this case, it did because I began to think about it in terms of his distinction between autonomy and heteronomy.
Mm,
Yeah, right.
Things that are heteronomous are directed by something outside themselves.
Yeah.
And if everything were like that, then you get this absurdity. Wait, you're directed by this, which is directed by that, and so on. At
mm,
some point, there must be an autonomous director. And so I think of the fifth way as establishing not a designer of the universe, but something like a conductor or a director, some being that assigns things the tendencies they have, is quite compatible with some of the actors being method actors who are making up their lines on the spot and so on.
Yeah.
That's fine, but they've been given the tendencies by the director, and then they get to have their own independent causal powers and so on, and their own independent decisions about direction after that. But yeah, as soon as I thought, wait, not everything can be heteronomous. Something at some point actually has to be directing things, and it's be giving the directions from within itself.
That's a good way to put it.
Then it was like, oh, that's what the fifth way is about.
Yeah.
And that some of these things happen through evolutionary processes is just neither here nor there.
Yeah.
mm.
I mean, Thomas actually, he's not opposed to design arguments, actually. So I think forget now where he refers to John of Damascus, and
Yeah.
he gives a kind of very early fine-tuning argument, basically, that the universe had to be fine-tuned or it would have destroyed itself by now, basically. And Aquinas quotes that approvingly. But it's interesting that there's no appeal to such cosmic harmony or anything like that in the fifth way. So it's clearly not a design argument for Thomas.
That's right.
I,
That clearly differentiates it from his Summa Gentiles
Yeah,
version.
right, exactly.
And actually, where he does mention John of Damascus is when he's talking about the unity of God. He wants
Yeah,
to show you there's only one God
right,
and that
that's
God
right.
isn't a Humean committee or something like that.
Yeah,
mm,
And then he's like, look, if God were like that, then this would be a mess. Like an orchestra with different conductors for each section, or like the Greek and Roman gods vying against each other and causing chaos.
yeah. I mean, it's not his only argument for the unity of God, but
No,
it's
it is one of the
one of the
arguments.
arguments. Yeah.
um, okay. All right. Awesome. So I think what I'll do now is ask you both a couple of personal questions, more personal questions, and then we can loop back and talk about the gap objection, which we've touched on indirectly at various points, but there are a couple of versions of that I'd like to run past you. So first, Dan, so you're a Protestant, as I understand, unless there have been developments that I'm unaware of, and Rob has,
No, that's right. I'm a
persuaded you.
Presbyterian.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah, I'm a Presbyterian.
yeah. Okay. And so does that give you a different perspective on the five ways, do you think, relative to Rob's as a kind of neo-Thomist? Um,
Not really. I mean, for one thing, I've always been very orthodox in my beliefs, so I don't think there's actually in terms of the actual theology, a big
Hmm.
gap between Presbyterianism and Catholicism at all. It's more
Not on these kind of points.
not on
Yeah.
these kind of
Mm.
points. I
No.
mean, I'm a classical theist
Mm.
through and through. So really, I am fine with calling myself a Presbyterian Thomist. I don't see any
Nice,
problem. Um,
nice.
so in that sense, no, I haven't felt anything. On the other hand, it does give me a perspective from which to look at what is happening in a lot of Protestantism now and reevaluate the arguments that Catholic anti-Reformation thinkers were using. Basically, each side was bashing the other with various skeptical arguments they had learned from rediscovering Sextus. And the Catholic argument was to some extent, look, without any criterion like the councils or the word of the Pope, if it's just scripture alone, you guys are going to divide into thousands of different sects. And I look around myself and think, well, they were right about that. So it makes me nervous.
I've been thinking about that too, I will say, as Rob knows. But yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, so those arguments make much more sense to me now than they used to. But yeah, I guess overall, I tend to think there's really, in terms of this aspect of theology, very little gap between Catholicism and Protestantism.
Yeah.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
think this will get a lot of Protestants to reevaluate some of the non-classical theisms that are out there right now that
Yeah,
are growing in popularity, unfortunately.
that's right. They should stop it.
Um, yeah, stop worshiping Zeus right now. I'm kidding.
Yes,
Exactly.
exactly.
Right.
Um, so and Rob, I think I know a fact about your biography is that earlier in your career, you had a relatively dim view of natural theology, right? And now you're a pretty enthusiastic proponent of it. And I'm
Yeah.
sure that there's a long story there, but like what's the short story about how it is that you came to reappraise these sorts of arguments?
Well, like I said, it was just sort of stumbling into Aquinas again in the 90s and realizing that there was more to these particular arguments than I'd realized before, and that got me thinking about it. And as I think, I'm not really opposed to arguments from design and arguments from morality and so on. I think those all have value, but it does seem to me that you need something like the five ways as a kind of anchor, as a kind of foundation for the others, right? And it's very hard to persuade somebody, I think, with fine tuning or whatever, that there's this infinite intelligence because they're going to say, why should I jump to that conclusion? Right?
Mm.
That seems like a wild idea. But if I've got something like this in place already, say, look, there's going to be this uncaused cause. It's going to be an absolute being, a being that has all attributes to an unlimited degree, and so on. At least it creates plausibility to this hypothesis, right? Which you can then use, feed all these empirical facts into. So I think it's very helpful. I mean, I was influenced by someone like Swinburne as well, and I don't think his strategy is without merit, but I do think the weakest point of his strategy is the idea that theism has some non-negligible probability to begin with,
Mm.
and he, he doesn't really have a good story for that, I don't think.
Mm. Hmm. Interesting. Okay. All right. The gap objection. So as I understand it, this is like a sort of two-part objection. So and I think you've said quite a bit already about one part of it, and then we haven't touched on the other. So yeah, like one common response to the five ways is that there's a gap between the immediate conclusion of each of these arguments and the ultimate conclusion that the capital G God exists. So like maybe I could grant that there's an uncaused cause or a necessary being, but then I could reasonably wonder whether that's an all-knowing, all perfect being. I And then the second part though is that there's even if we become confident that okay, yeah, there's we are talking about an unlimited perfect being, a being that's identical to its active existence, whatever, that there's a kind of gap between that being and the Abrahamic God Yahweh, which is the God that both of you believe in. Yeah, so somebody could wonder, okay, yeah, I mean, how close does this really get me to the God that I actually, as a believing Christian or a believing Jew, believe would affirm the existence of? So, yeah, what are your thoughts about that general kind of gap objection?
We have a chapter of the book um, about this, really, because I think one of the objections that people like Alvin Plantinga make against this classical conception and against divine simplicity in particular is that you end up with a concept of God that is so remote from humanity that it's not a God that we can meaningfully pray to
You're
or
worshiping
worship.
a property is his way of putting it.
Yes,
Yeah,
exactly.
yeah, right. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that's a mistake. I think, in fact, my own view is that anything lesser than this is actually a God that I worry about worshiping. I kind of want a God that exists to the maximal degree, that really is fully perfect in all of these respects. And I don't like compromising, and I don't think anything about this contradicts the sort of view I have. In fact, one of the things I'm fond of as a refutation of this is just going through common hymns that we use in worship and the way that they talk about God. Immortal, invisible, God only wise. That go through all of, in fact, that hymn is great for just listing these classical properties of God. And I don't think anybody sings that hymn and thinks, oh, that's a weird remote God that I can't worship or sing to. I think that is what we've all thought. At least maybe I'm naive, but I sort of grew up thinking, yeah, that's the God that I worship. And so the one place where I think there is more to be said is with questions of prayer. Because if God really is unchanging and unchangeable, then what sense does it make to think that God listens to our prayers or answers our prayers? But that's, I think, a matter of not properly understanding the relationship between a being that is outside of time and those of us who are in time. That can be described in a way that makes it sound like this unbridgeable gap, but I don't think it is. I think it's rather something like this picture you get from Augustine or Boethius of God being there on a mountaintop, not on the road of time, but nevertheless being able to understand it and see it all at once. And that doesn't mean God can't interact with the things on that road. It's just that they're all, I mean, speaking here metaphorically, simultaneous from God's point of view. So I don't think there's actually any contradiction here, but
Yeah.
admittedly it's a there's an explanation. How can a God outside of time interact with time? That's a legitimate question that needs an answer.
Yeah. I mean, I think people get into trouble precisely because they don't recognize how different God is from us, right? So if you think in order to interact in time, God has to have a bunch of ideas inside his mind that are also themselves changeable and contingent. Then of course, and then you say, but he doesn't change. Now suddenly,
Yeah.
now suddenly, okay, so now he doesn't know anything about what's going on in the world because he can't have any contingent or changeable ideas. But in fact, I think that's a mistake, even about the human intellect, right? Because there are things that we can understand not by representing the thing inside our minds. So, for instance, I understand the meaning or the intentionality of my own thoughts, not because I have another thought about the meaning of that thought, which I have to have in order to think. No, in other words, it's just that the meaning of the thought is immediately present to my mind. In the same way, this changeable, contingent world is immediately present to God. He knows it all intimately, not by duplicating it inside himself, right, with a bunch of representations that are changeable and contingent, but just by knowing it directly. And so similarly, he acts on the world directly without first forming a volition, I'm going to do this thing, and then implementing it. He just does it, right? And so I don't see myself any problem with prayer. I mean, I pray, and I think that it makes a difference to what God does, right? For one thing, it makes it possible for God to answer the prayer, which he couldn't have done if I hadn't prayed, right? So,
Right.
so, it's not that I change God. It's though I push representations around inside his brain or something. That's not what happens. But it does make a difference to what he does, I think.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I think
I'll
this is
resist
Charles
the urge.
Hartshorn's mistake, this
Yes,
one about representation.
exactly.
He thinks of it on that model, and so he has to have God be relative and changing.
Yeah,
All of process theology is corrupted by that
yeah,
mistake, I think.
yeah.
Yeah. I I'm going to resist the urge to ask the millions of questions that I have in relation to that because as somebody who started off my philosophical career really confused about the free will problem. A lot of questions come to mind, but that's for
That's a
another
hard
time.
one for sure.
Yeah.
That's a hard one
Yeah.
for anybody, I think, right?
Yeah. 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 Okay. One more objection. I'm mindful of your time, so one more objection, and then we can wind down here. I imagine this to be easy for you to deal with, but I can imagine a skeptical critic saying something along the lines of, well, look, Aquinas was writing what in the 13th century, and here we are in the year 2025. And Rob Koons and Dan Bonevac have had to write a book telling us what Aquinas was saying. Um, does that call into question sort of like the goodness of Aquinas's arguments themselves, or perhaps like the viability of the project, that it has to be endlessly like revisited, reinterpreted, and so forth? Yeah, what would you say in response to that kind of concern?
Maybe it means he was way ahead of his time.
Yeah, right. Yeah, no, I mean, people still write about Plato and Aristotle. It doesn't
Yeah.
Yeah,
mean, oh, we might as well throw them away. But people, 2,000 years and we still haven't figured them out.
Yeah, no,
yeah,
that's true. There's
And
still a lot going on here, so we don't understand. It's worth understanding.
yes, yeah, I mean, I think it's a sign of a really deep and rich thinker that people can think for hundreds or thousands of years even and find new things to say, new things to uncover. And so I think it's a testimony to Aquinas's brilliance, really. But the other thing is, in this case, there's something very specific that happened because Thomas was, um, as you say, lived in the 13th century. In the middle of the 14th century, the Black Plague struck. And it was absolutely devastating, especially on university communities.
Yeah.
It wiped out not only a horrifying percentage of the population of Europe, but probably a majority of the people who knew Latin.
yes,
When you compare the philosophy that was done between, say, 1200 and 1350 to what then was done for several hundred years afterwards, you're struck by the fact that the level of sophistication dropped radically.
mm,
And in particular, any understanding of modality, of causation, and so on, really was wiped out until the 20th century. And we've been
From a
fighting to recover it.
logical point of view, the Renaissance was the Dark Ages.
It was the Dark Ages, exactly. Rhetoric basically pushed logic aside.
Yeah, yeah,
And I mean, there were real linguistic advances as a result of that, but not in logic. It was devastating for logic.
mm,
So I think it's only recently we've had the tools to go back to the medievals and say, oh, finally we can understand what Aquinas and Duns Scotus and Occam and so on were saying.
mm,
And the same is true of Anselm. I think now we actually have a better understanding of what they were up to than anybody did in the intervening centuries between, say, 1350 and 1959.
something like that. Yeah, right,
mm,
exactly.
And so
Yeah,
finally, we've rediscovered the tools. And so now I think there's a lot to be done on that whole medieval period. It's just a gold mine of philosophical material
yeah,
and distinction drawing. Those distinctions were just largely lost for centuries, and we're only now rediscovering them. So I think unlike maybe some other areas of the history of philosophy, this is just something that's been left largely unexamined due to prejudice against religion, but also
mm,
due to just lacking the tools needed to understand it.
yeah.
mm,
Yeah, people like Descartes, Leibniz, and they had to sort of reinvent the wheel. And
Yeah,
looking back now, we can say, well, it was pretty good, but it was not nearly as sophisticated as Aquinas's efforts
yeah,
several
exactly.
hundred years earlier. So,
And it was infused with this assumption that metaphysics and epistemology dovetail
yeah,
in such a way that the metaphysical categories are basically epistemological categories.
yeah.
I think that's a profound mistake, and it's one that the medievals did not make.
Yeah, right. Yeah, they couldn't really grasp the idea of God as being identical to his own active existence. Instead they were talking about it being sort of inconceivable that God not exist, which is an entirely different claim.
That's right. They want to interpret all this as
Yeah,
analytic,
yeah,
and
yeah,
that's
yeah,
so foreign to Aquinas' perspective
Yeah,
on this.
it really left them open to the human kind of objections.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's a fascinating perspective. Yeah, and I've heard you talk about that before, Dan, just the effects that the bubonic plague had on intellectual life, but I think that it's really underappreciated.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it was devastating. And hey, this is to some extent a highly influential thinker in my own tradition. But you read Calvin, and although I think there are a lot of interesting and creative ideas, the
Mm.
level of philosophical and theological sophistication compared to what was being done 200 or 300 years before is horrifying. So,
Mm.
And it's
um,
even worse than that, I think, because there's this kind of modernist telling of the story that I myself believed until I sort of educated myself out of it, that pretty much before Descartes and Hobbes and Galileo, people were just kind of wandering around in darkness and nothing
Yeah.
particularly
Yeah.
interesting happened for about 1,000 years or so. And that's
oh,
close to the opposite of the truth, I think.
yeah,
Yeah.
it's
Yeah.
terrible. We
Yeah.
have courses, and it's the standard intro philosophy course. This goes Plato, Aristotle, Descartes. That's a
Yeah.
2,000 year gap.
Yeah.
And we
Same.
just
I
act
had
like,
no
oh
idea
yeah,
what
people like
happened.
fell
Yeah.
asleep for 2,000 years and then Rip Van Winkle, they woke up with Descartes.
Yeah.
It's all
Exactly.
crazy.
Um,
The faith as though it was no reason at all, just blind faith. Yeah.
Yeah,
yeah.
no,
Completely wrong.
completely
Yeah.
wrong. Yeah.
Yeah.
And
Where do the five ways rank, do you think, in the arguments for God? Are they the strongest, or like, there are a whole bunch of arguments for God. Maybe
yeah.
more now than ever before because we have all these kind of neo-Bayesian type arguments. Yeah, where do you
Yeah.
place the five ways?
Well, I would have put them much further down the list, but now I put them definitely in the top 10 somewhere.
Hmm. Hmm.
Yeah, yeah. No, I think that's right. I mean, there are other arguments I take very seriously. I like Anselm's monologian argument. I like very much Augustine's argument. In
Nice.
his work
Yeah.
on free will, he spelled
Yeah.
out this argument from thought or truth or whatever you
Yeah.
want to call it. And I think that's actually a brilliant and deep argument that deserves much more attention than it gets. So I think there are other very good arguments, but yeah, I agree. Even if these aren't the top five, I think they're top
Yeah.
10 quality, definitely. And really, when you look then later at things that Descartes does, for example, they look like oddly. I mean, he's not just taking over the five ways. If anything, in the fifth meditation, he's just taking over Anselm. But the third meditation argument is an odd twist in a certain sense.
Yeah.
I
Well,
don't,
he's painted himself in such a tight corner
yeah,
with the skeptical hypothesis, whereas Aquinas can take advantage of all the knowledge we have of the world. So he doesn't have to focus on
that,
sense data or something.
yeah, exactly, exactly. So he's really pinned himself, yeah, painted himself into a corner, and now he's having to shimmy along. And
Yeah.
yeah, I think it's a better argument than a lot of people think, but
Yeah.
it's a very different kind of argument, and in its own way, much more controversial, I think.
Yeah. I mean, there are versions of Anselm's ontological argument, I think, that are better than Aquinas recognized.
Yes.
He's really looking at the simpler version that's in
Hmm.
chapter 2, yes, it is, and not really taking into account the modalized version in chapter 3. So,
Yeah.
yeah, I put that in close to the top 10 anyway myself.
The
Yeah.
ontological argument is what awakened me from my slumbers. I know contemporary philosophers love to hate on it, but I have a soft spot in my heart for the ontological argument.
I do too,
Yeah,
actually.
yeah. No, I think it's a helpful argument. It certainly points to the fact that you can't really say that God just contingently fails to exist. I mean,
That's
he
right.
either necessarily exists or he's impossible. It can't. It's got to be one or the other.
Yeah.
And I
And
think
I
we would
think
I
Thomas
think
would agree
that
with that.
Yeah, yeah,
I think also if God exists, then we would expect that there would be a lot of successful arguments for God's existence. It would be surprising, like
yeah.
if God exists, it would be surprising if God sort of set reality up in such a way that there's like only one way that you can that you can come to see that.
Right, right. I think that's
Right.
right. I think that's right. Yeah.
Yeah, I
So
love planning this paper, 2 dozen arguments, or 2 dozen or so arguments
Yeah.
for the existence of
Right.
God.
yeah,
Uh,
yeah. I mean, my attitude towards that is totally changed. That when I first encountered that, it's like, it's ridiculous. But yeah, no, it's like he probably vastly undercounted, actually.
Yeah.
that's
No, I
right.
think that's right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
This has been amazing. Thank you both so much for your time. Any closing remarks, thoughts? I will of course provide links to your websites, to Dan's YouTube channel, to Rob's Substack. But yeah, like any other thoughts about the five ways, your project, or anything at all that you would like to share before we close out.
An ad. We have not just one book coming out, but two.
Right.
There's going to be a more popular version. So those who want to slog through the modal logic and the Latin, the first version to come out is going to be the one you want. But for those who want to avoid that, but understand the ideas in a much more accessible way, there's going to be a shorter book coming out afterwards that tries to explain it to a general audience. So,
Hopefully both in 2026. I
yeah.
think
That was my question. Okay, so next
Yeah,
next
one
year.
early in the year and one late in the
yeah.
year.
So
Awesome.
yeah. Yeah, the first book will really be designed to persuade people that we got Aquinas right. And
Yes.
if you don't care about that, you just want the argument, then
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Uh, all right. Again, thank you so much. Maybe I can keep you on for a couple of seconds, but I'll stop recording here.
Okay. Okay.
Okay.
Great. Our pleasure.